Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Peterson Institute for International Economics. I'm Adam Posen, the Institute's president, and it's my pleasure and our Institute's honor to host MP Rachel Reeves, the Shadow Chancellor of the Exchequer and MP for Leeds West since 2010 from the UK. Many of us remember 20 and 30 years ago the desire among various center-left parties, including the Democrats in the US and Labor in the UK, to try to find the so-called third way or other such terms. And there was a group which had electoral success doing that. Since then, a lot of that program, which frankly a number of people in this building were part of, has been repudiated by various parts of the left, more so in the US than elsewhere, as neoliberalism, to be replaced by a new form of economic thinking. I'm not putting the ideological burden on Ms. Reeves' shoulders. She is an intellectual leader and a policy maker likely to be, and most importantly, a working politician. So such empty concepts may not matter to her. But in the period of the last several weeks, we have had important speeches by US Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen, National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, unusually on economics. We hosted here about 2 months ago Laurence Boone, the Minister for Europe from France, who articulated her vision, obviously speaking for the French government, on where they might go in terms of the intellectual orientation for dealing with China and the insecure world. Just over a year ago, Christine Lagarde gave a speech on that. And so in this intellectual ferment of dealing with how to make a progressive and just policy that's sustainable in a scary world, it is our privilege to have Rachel Reeves come to Washington and make her statement of how she and the UK Labour Party are thinking about these issues. Ms. Reeves is going to give a speech, a new business model for Britain, building economic strength in an age of insecurity. We will follow that by a few questions from me and then open it up to our in-person audience. We welcome all of you online as well. Just to recap, Rachel has been the MP for Leeds West since 2010, the rare trained economist who actually put herself out there as an electoral candidate. She's currently Shadow Chancellor of the Exchequer. She's served in a number of front bench shadow roles for the Labour Party, including Shadow Pensions Minister, Shadow Secretary of State for Work and Pensions, and Shadow Chief Secretary of the Treasury, as well as something that does not translate, Shadow Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, excuse me. Prior to being an MP, Rachel worked as an economist at the Bank of England, as well as being seconded to the British Embassy in Washington, where a number of us got to know her in both those roles. She also, in her copious free time, is an author and has a book, I believe, coming out in this fall, The Women Who Made Modern Economics, A Personal History. We will now hear from Rachel Reeves with her main hat on, which is making economic policy. Rachel, thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you, Adam, for that introduction, and thank you very much to the Peterson Institute for hosting me here today. I first came to Washington, as you said, a little over 20 years ago. As a young economist at the Bank of England, I was seconded to the British Embassy here in Washington to analyse the American economy. In Britain, that was a time of prosperity and progress, with wages and productivity rising. Little did we know then that within a decade, things would change so dramatically. And now, under successive Conservative governments, progress stalled, wages flatlined, and prosperity turned to stagnation. Not long ago, I met a mum and dad in a town called Worthing on England's south coast. Between them, they held down 5 jobs, juggling work with the responsibilities of childcare, and they struggle to make ends meet. As a family, they spend just half a day a week together. But while they give so much, they get such little in return. And they live in a world where those most basic of hopes, time together as a family, buying their own home, saving for a decent retirement, all feel painfully distant. And one thing about that conversation will always stay with me. Because the mum in Worthing said something that I will never forget. She said, "You just wonder if you are doing something wrong." Well, she isn't doing something wrong, but something has gone wrong in our economic system. Our economy no longer works for working people. Their contributions are no longer respected, their enterprise is no longer rewarded, and even their most ordinary of hopes seem like impossible dreams. Today I'm going to talk about how errors in economic policy making allowed Britain's economy to weaken, how the long, hard years of austerity and the chaos of recent governments have compounded that change, and how global shocks exposed our weaknesses with devastating consequences for working people. But I'm also going to talk about an approach which I call securonomics that can right those wrongs. By drawing on the talent and efforts of millions of working people in all parts of our country, by forging a new partnership between an active state and dynamic open markets, and by fostering a new era of global partnerships between nations with shared values and shared interests, all with the goal of making hard work pay for working people in Britain once again. Now, Britain has incredible strengths. The second largest exporter of services in the world, Europe's leading financial centre, home to some of the world's most dynamic businesses at the very edge of possibilities, with world-leading universities that are expanding the frontiers of human knowledge. But today's inflation numbers for the UK show inflation remaining stubbornly high, and the IMF's forecasts this week show that the UK is still expected to have the highest inflation in the G7 this year, and our long-term growth showing little signs of improvement after a decade or more of weakness. Now, Britain's immense potential is being wasted. At the root of this, I believe, are 2 errors in economic policy making. The first of these is what I consider to be a fundamental underappreciation of the role of government. That error dictated that a government's primary economic imperatives should simply be to get out of the way of free enterprise. In the 80s and the early 90s, this meant cutting taxes and stripping away at regulation and addressing only the most egregious market failures. Advocates of this approach believed that wealth would trickle down. But while wealth was generated, there wasn't much trickling. Instead, we witnessed a steady flow upwards. Meanwhile, whole industries were allowed to decline or disappear. Whole communities were thrown on the scrap heap with no alternative work to pursue. And public services and social security were weakened by 1,000 cuts. The second error flowed from the first. It was the assumption that the people and places that matter to a country's economic success are few in number. This misconceived view held that a few dynamic cities and a few successful industries were all that a nation needs to thrive. In Britain, this meant that the southeast of England could forge ahead, while the City of London and a few other industries would power our economy. The result was a paucity of ambition for too many places, the hollowing out of our industrial strength, and a tragic waste of human potential across vast swathes of our country. The New Labour era, overlapping with the New Democrat era here, reversed some of these trends. During a period in which Britain experienced faster growth than many of our competitors, including France, Germany, Japan, and Italy, Labour turned prosperity into progress. Public services were rescued from the point of collapse. Investment in education, it dramatically improved educational outcomes. And a focus on older and youth inequality saw 1 million pensioners and children lifted out of poverty in Britain. But a progressive politics built for an era of strong productivity growth and increasingly frictionless trade did not have the answers for the world economy after 2008. The last Labour government did understand that, which is why, after the financial crisis, it worked to develop a more active state, reviving industrial strategy in Britain. And the results are evident today. The seeds of our successful life sciences industry, which has blossomed into a truly world-leading sector, were planted by Labour in that period. But 13 years ago, the Conservatives returned to power in Britain, and we dramatically changed course. First came the brutal austerity that followed the financial crisis, where our cuts in spending were far deeper and far faster than our international peers. Demand was sucked out of the economy, and investment, the lifeblood of economic growth, stagnated. And for all the bitterness of the medicine, the patient got no healthier. Even before COVID struck, government debt was nearly 30% higher than it had been 10 years before. And after austerity came the chaos. First, we had Brexit without a plan, introducing pervasive uncertainty into our economic life. Next came the madness of Liz Truss's drive-by premiership, which sent our gilts markets tumbling and saw Kwasi Kwarteng, the then Chancellor, dashing out of an IMF meeting here in Washington to be sacked by the Prime Minister. Today, under Rishi Sunak, we have a tired administration out of ideas. And while we were promised sound management, it feels more like managed decline to me. Held back by these two eras of policymaking, weakened by 13 years of austerity and then chaos, Britain has been buffeted by a world that has become increasingly uncertain. We're now living through what I consider to be an age of insecurity. In just the past few years, there have been 3 events that might easily be described as once in a generation, if not once in a lifetime. First, Britain's chaotic departure from the European Union, then the worst pandemic since 1918, and finally, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, bringing major conflict to the continent of Europe for the first time since the Second World War. In the years ahead, the pace of change offers little hope of letting up. A rising China is unbalancing the old global order of a unipolar world. Climate change presents our generation with its greatest moral and economic challenge. And new technology threatens to upend everything about how we live and how we work. In this new world, we have discovered the limits of globalization. We have seen that supply chains that prioritize only what is cheapest and fastest struggle when a crisis hits, be that PPE during COVID or energy following the invasion of Ukraine. We have discovered that a globalized system can be gamed by countries like China, who have undercut and ignored international trading rules and made it impossible for our own to compete. And in the process, we have allowed the production of critical technologies to slip from our grasp, costing us jobs and compromising our security. To witness Britain today is to witness a country buffeted by global forces. With our industrial capacity hollowed out, fluctuations in international markets hurt us more than most. With wages low and demand suppressed, our growth is anemic. 20 years ago, the average Briton was wealthier than their European neighbours. Today, the average French family is 10% richer than their British peers. In Germany, that figure rises to 19%. And in Britain, the old model is failing. In an uncertain world, we cannot rely on a handful of industries for our economic success. Nor can we outsource the supply of critical goods and services to the lowest bidder. Confronted by the challenges we face in the years ahead, no government can simply get out of the way of the market. And no democratic government can be content with a lack of decent work, with falling wages, and the dimming of people's hopes for a better life. To do so is to betray the people we were elected to represent and risk fanning the flames of populism, as our countries know only too well. That's why it's time for us to admit that globalization, as we knew it, is dead. We must care about where things are made and who owns them. We must foster new partnerships between the free market and an active state, and between countries across the world who share values and interests. This demands a new approach, one that I call securonomics. It focuses on the economic security of a nation, prioritizing economic strength and resilience in the face of our uncertain world, addressing the challenges of the future and finding opportunities within them. It also focuses on securing the finances of working people, good jobs, decent pay, strong public services, and an end to the relentless increases in the cost of living. I'm in Washington today because while the old Washington consensus might have been swept away, a new one is emerging. At its heart is what Treasury Secretary Yellen has called modern supply-side economics. The Biden administration is rebuilding America's economic security, its strength and its resilience. A more active state pursuing a modern industrial strategy is selecting the areas where America must guarantee its ability to produce what America needs, whether that's in digital technology through the CHIPS Act, or in clean energy and industry through the Inflation Reduction Act. Your government is working in partnership with a dynamic open market, where the state does what a government does best, making and shaping markets that are essential to America's resilience and future prosperity. Meanwhile, the free market does what only it can do, innovating, competing, creating wealth. This acknowledges the reality of our age and the economic necessity of resilience. It is a rejection of the hyperglobalization of old, but it is also an invitation to greater partnership between those countries that want to address the challenges and seize the opportunities of tomorrow together. Across the world, others are following suit. The Albanese administration's Powering Australia plan, Scholz's Climate and Transformation Fund in Germany, Macron's vision for economic sovereignty in Europe. You might well ask, what reaction has there been in Britain to this changing world? Well, my opposite number, Jeremy Hunt, the current Chancellor of the Exchequer, has made his position clear. He considers the Biden administration to be engaged in a distortive global subsidy race. Speaking at Davos earlier this year, Grant Shapps, Britain's Energy Secretary, called the policies dangerous. Well, what is dangerous is sitting on the sidelines while other countries forge ahead. I can promise today that a Labour government would be different. Earlier this year, Keir Starmer announced that Labour will be guided by a set of missions, the first of which is to secure the highest sustained growth in the G7, with good jobs and productivity in all parts of the country. Now, I know how ambitious this sounds, especially after our performance these last few years. But that does not deter me, because I know we can build a prospectus for economic prosperity that allows Britain to embrace the opportunities of the future, built on the rock of financial stability and economic security. With Labour, Britain will embrace securonomics. Now, that won't mean trying to make Britain a version of America, Australia, Germany, or France, because we know that won't work. It will mean becoming a better version of Britain by building on the existing strengths of our economy, our expertise in energy and life sciences, our professional services and creative industries, our world-leading universities, our enterprising and industrious people, and also by strengthening our economy when we must become more resilient, rebuilding the industrial foundations that we have lost and which have left us exposed to shocks, investing in the industries and technologies that will determine our future economic success, and building financial security in each and every household in Britain, with good jobs, decent pay, and fair working conditions, to ensure that working people can contribute to our national success and that their financial security underpins our economic success. Today, I have published a paper that sets out how a modern supply-side programme would deliver securonomics for Britain. It sets out how a new industrial strategy can identify those areas where the UK can and must thrive. It shows how an active strategic state will work in harmony with vibrant open markets. And it shows how we can build the industries and create the jobs of the future in the industrial heartlands of the past. That means cyber amongst the former coal and steel communities of South Wales, robotics and AI in business hubs in Lancashire's mill towns, and carbon capture and storage technologies pioneered and applied in manufacturing areas such as Teesside. Through Labour's Green Prosperity Plan, an initiative I first announced 18 months ago, we will make public investments in the industries that are crucial to Britain's future success. A new national wealth fund will invest in Britain's industries and provide a long-term return to the taxpayer. GB Energy, a new public energy company, will invest in the clean energy sources of today and of tomorrow. Throughout, we will use public investment to underpin and unlock further private investment, just as the Inflation Reduction Act and CHIPS Act have done here. And we will remove the barriers that too often stop investment, like Britain's ludicrous planning system. And the reason this matters so much is simple: jobs. In every industry that we are building or rebuilding in Britain, it is the jobs that matter. Decent jobs in every part of the country. Jobs that pay well, putting more spending power in the pockets of working people. Jobs that mean that a young person who wants to get on in life no longer has to get out of their hometown. Jobs that workers in Britain are equipped with the skills to do. And just as the Biden administration has done here, we must build the industries of the future in partnership with both unions and employers. Delivering all of this demands that we remove the barriers that currently hold people back, a particularly acute problem in Britain today. This means expanding affordable childcare, helping women get back into the workforce, fixing Britain's struggling health service to get millions off of the sick list, making sure that we have the right employment support and reforms to support getting more people back into work, and improving vocational and education training to equip people for the jobs of the future. When looking across the pond to Biden's administration, Britain's current government sees a subsidy arms race. In a fascinating recent speech that Adam Posen also mentioned, National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan answered this question directly. He showed that while globalisation as we know it may be dead, a new era of multilateral partnership is emerging in its place. I agree. Nations who share values and concerns and who want to seize the opportunities of tomorrow can and must work together to boost our collective resilience and security. It is a signal achievement of Britain's recent government that it has managed to be both too open and too closed. Too open in letting Britain's industrial strength hollow out, and too closed in the barriers to trade it has erected through its chaotic Brexit deal. A modern supply-side approach in Britain would see us rebuild our industrial strength, but it would have trade and partnership at its heart too. Britain with Labour will be a trading nation, exporting across the world and open to business and investment at home. Britain cannot, should not, and Labour with Labour will not try to go it alone. In 2025, the UK's deal with the European Union is up for review. While there's no going back into the European Union, the single market, or the customs union, with Labour, we would make trade easier with Europe and rebuild our ties with our closest neighbours. In the last few years, the British government has let another critical relationship slip. In his recent remarks, the US National Security Advisor mentioned a number of international partners: Canada, the EU, Korea, Angola, Taiwan, Brazil. I could go on. But one country, to me at least, was notable by its absence: Britain. A relationship once called special has been allowed to wane. With Labour, that will change. Labour will build a new special relationship, and it will be a green special relationship, focusing on the clean energy economy, where both Britain and America have signature strengths. As any visitor to Britain will tell you, we are blessed with more wind than almost any other nation. And so we have the second biggest offshore wind capacity of any country in the world. We have the potential to lead the way in new technologies like green hydrogen and carbon capture and storage, where our unique geology provides us with storage capacity 500 times the UK's entire annual carbon emissions. Working together, we can guarantee a resilient supply of clean energy and technologies that will power the UK for decades, even centuries ahead. In this process, we can bring down bills, create good jobs, and strengthen our energy security, tame inflation, and build on our long history of economic collaboration. Today, a Rolls-Royce engine built in Britain, but fitted to a Boeing plane manufactured in America, is sold in one recent sale for worth $34 billion to India's national airline. The green technologies of the future offer new opportunities to power. Whether that's a Rolls-Royce engine running on sustainable aviation fuel, or Britain's pioneering work on floating offshore wind deployed in the deep oceans off the Pacific West Coast. By establishing a nationwide network of climate export hubs, a Labour government would place Britain at the heart of the global supply chains in the key technologies of the future. This is a new multilateralism, without the excesses of hyperglobalization. This is the promise of securonomics. I believe in a better future for Britain. It is one where our businesses are world leaders, where Britain has a leading role in the industries that will define all of our futures, powered by the contribution and efforts of millions of working people. So rather than expecting wealth to trickle down, we ensure that, to borrow a phrase, wealth is built from the bottom up and the middle out. If Labour wins the next election, I intend to be a very different Chancellor to my recent predecessors. In one sense, I know that I will be. Like Treasury Secretary Yellen, America's first female Treasury Secretary, I will break a glass ceiling that has been placed for too long in Britain by becoming Britain's first ever female Chancellor of the Exchequer. I will chart a new course for Britain. It begins by accepting that the world has changed and that Britain must change with it. In our age of insecurity, we have discovered the weaknesses of our old economic model. Too unambitious about the role that an active state can play, too willing to believe that wealth will trickle down, and too reliant on the contribution of too few number of industries and too few people. From the ashes of hyperglobalization, securonomics emerges, building the industries that guarantee Britain's economic security, forging resilience at home while creating new partnerships abroad, and bringing together an active state in partnership with a vibrant market. Securonomics means that a mum and dad in Worthing or in Wyoming who are doing the right thing no longer feel like they are doing something wrong. But more than that, they can start to take advantage of the enormous opportunities in our economies. This is the true promise of securonomics. Security that provides the foundations upon which we can build hope. Hope as a nation, knowing that our future can be brighter than our past, and hope as individuals, knowing that we can get on, not just get by, that we can provide for our families and pursue our ambitions, whatever they are. While this may seem like the most ordinary of hope, it's been out of reach for too long, for too many. With Labour in power, that will change, because from security comes hope. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Shadow Chancellor Reeves. You did pick up on the broad new take. Since we're the Peterson Institute for International Economics, before opening it up to our audience, if we may, can I press you a bit on some of the economic aspects of your program and some of the international aspects of your program? So I frankly think the analysis bears out your point about the austerity since 2010 of successive UK Tory governments being a problem. I argued against it when I was in the UK as a policymaker at that time. But you didn't mention some of the very real challenges that the UK does face on the fiscal front. The long-term underpayment of healthcare workers and some other workers in the public sector, the breakdown of transportation infrastructure, demographic shifts that affect all our countries, high-income countries. On other stages, you have spoken about the need for fiscal discipline, and you made some mention of financial stability. How are you going to manage this admittedly very difficult hand you've been left to play? How do you set the budget priorities in that situation?
Well, thank you for that question, Adam, and for engaging so much with the work that I've been doing. An incoming Labour government will face an economic picture which poses a lot of constraints. And it means that an incoming Labour government will not be able to do everything that it might want to do, not as quickly as it might want to do it. We're going to be left with a debt to GDP ratio of around 90%, the highest tax burden in 70 years, inflation, well, we'll see where it is by the next election.
But as of this morning.
8.7% in the most recent numbers. The IMF are forecasting growth of 0.4% this year, which the current Chancellor welcomed as a huge sign of success, simply because the economy is no longer forecast to shrink. Well, my ambitions are a lot higher than that. But the fiscal constraints, which is what you focused on in your question, Adam, are very real. Now, last year, in the so-called mini-budget from Prime Minister Truss and Chancellor Kwarteng, tried an experiment of unfunded tax cuts. And that did huge damage to the reputation, the global reputation of Britain, and it did huge damage to family finances and economic security in Britain because, as I mentioned in that speech, you had that huge turbulence in gilt markets, and now people are paying what I describe as a Tory mortgage penalty when they come to remortgage their homes.
This is just a timer, sorry.
Around 2.5 million people will remortgage their homes this year. On average, they'll be paying something like £300 extra a month. So the lesson that I take from that is that fiscal discipline is just incredibly important. And I'm not going to make any unfunded tax cuts or spending increases. And I've said that everything in our manifesto from the Labour Party be fully costed and fully funded, because you can't have any plans for economic growth unless you have that rock of economic stability and financial stability, and you mess with that at your peril. And that does mean that difficult choices will have to made. But similarly, the answer of just going for more tax rises, I just don't buy that either, because it's one of the things that's choking off economic growth in our country with the highest tax burden in 70 years. The last Labour government managed to improve living standards and improve public services because it did what the Conservatives in the last 13 years have failed to do, which is grow the economy. And that's why Keir Starmer and me have said that the #1 mission of an incoming Labour government is to get that economic growth, because unless you have that economic growth, you won't be able to invest in public services or improve in living standards. So that, for me, is the key focus.
Thank you. And you and the leader of the opposition, as well as some of your colleagues on the shadow front bench, have been talking about your mission to secure the highest sustained growth in the G7. Again, there was a lot of work already done and a lot of overhype about deregulation as a path to growth. So that is probably not where you want to go. But realistically, getting growth up is hard when, as you mentioned, there was a slowdown in productivity growth across the whole OECD 20 years, starting roughly 20 years ago. So in that context, first, what do you think is the reason that the UK seems to have had the biggest sustained fall in productivity growth compared to its peers? And second, how big a difference do you think the investment in energy, life sciences, and a couple of the other key industries you mentioned, how, just order of magnitude, what will that do for growth? What will that do for employment?
So in terms of why the performance in the UK has been so much worse than our peers, I put it down to the two errors that I identified towards the beginning of the speech. The first error is that growth comes from a small number of people in a small number of parts of the country. You don't really need much industrial strategy. And the second error sort of flows from the first. The best thing that a government can do is get out of the way. Now, I think that the opportunities, but also the challenges that we face, requires a more active and a strategic state, working in partnership with business, but also with allies internationally to secure those opportunities. You know, there's a global race on for some of the jobs of the future: carbon capture and storage, green hydrogen, floating offshore wind, some of the examples I gave in my speech. Now, I think there's every reason to believe that Britain can be a world leader in those sectors. But at the moment, other governments around the world are putting much more effort into getting those jobs and those investments in Britain than we are in the UK. And I gave the example of floating offshore wind and wind energy in my speech, because in some ways it's been a massive British success story. We're the second biggest producer of wind energy in the world. But for, I think it's every megawatt of offshore wind energy produced in the UK, we create 0.5 jobs. In Denmark, it's 5.5 jobs. The reason is that they had a strategy in Denmark to capture the supply chain, do the manufacturing, do the research, and they've got the jobs. But we assemble them, host the wind farms, but we're not making the technology, and we're not making the manufactured goods. So that's why we need an industrial strategy with government and business working together to seize some of these opportunities to get the jobs. I don't want us just producing the energy. I want us to get the jobs that go alongside it. And that's the insight that I take from what the Biden administration are doing as well.
And the international dimension, as you said, is something I want to come back to in a moment, but I want to pick up on something which I know has been a sincere concern of yours for a long time, as well as a front order issue for your party, which is the issue of regional divergences, deindustrialized regions versus the City of London, things like that. I don't mean literally the city, I mean the region. This is not unique to Britain. The U.S. has regions, states, localities that have fallen way behind. France, despite, as your mention of them, outperforming in GDP per capita. They have huge divergence between Paris and the South. The historical record, whether in China, Italy, Germany, of trying to catch up backwards in the sense of economic opportunities regions is not great. What are the lessons you take about what's a successful policy, since you've spoken about that goal? And there's been a lot of recent talk about directing the pension funds and potentially a British bank towards that goal. Could you say a bit more about what you have in mind?
So we've set out the mission to have the highest sustained growth in the G7, but how growth is generated and also how it is shared really matters to me. So good jobs and productivity in all parts of the country matters. You know, you could have a model of growth where, you know, London and the Southeast further diverges from the rest of the country and created great wealth and prosperity. And then you redistribute that in some way to other parts of the country. But talent, I believe, is evenly distributed, but opportunity in Britain is not. There are many opportunities in some parts of the country and very few in others. And so at the heart of the modern industrial strategy and the green prosperity plan that Keir and myself are setting out is about how to rejuvenate, revitalise, reindustrialise some of those towns and cities that have been left out and left behind by a hollowing out of industry. And the great thing about some of these jobs and opportunities of the future in carbon capture or floating offshore wind is those jobs aren't going to be in London and the Southeast. They're going to be on the east coast of England and Scotland by the North Sea. They're going to be in those towns that led the first industrial revolution in Britain. And that's really exciting because it will allow people wherever they live in the UK to fulfill their potential and contribute and have the dignity of a good job that pays a decent wage with a sense of purpose. You mentioned the issue about pension funds. Look, we've got a real challenge in Britain, and this is, you know, something I was talking about with people in New York a couple of days ago, that startup and scale-up businesses in Britain, when they're looking for pre-seed and seed funding and then the different funding rounds, often struggle to raise that capital in the UK. And they look across to the US and start raising that capital here. And then when that company gets to the point where they want to list, and they look at listing in London or look at listing in New York, and more are choosing New York. And it's even worse than that. You've got companies that are already listed in the UK that are delisting and relisting in the US. And that poses a real challenge for the UK because we want to keep that wealth and keep those jobs and those diffusion of ideas within Britain. Otherwise, we're going to miss out on some of our own homegrown talent. And so Lord Jim O'Neill, who is former at Goldman Sachs and was a minister under David Cameron and George Osborne for the Conservatives, did a review for my party on how we can make Britain the best place to start and grow a business. And one area where I think there is real potential is unlocking money from UK pension funds. At the moment, pension savers in the UK have got something like £2 trillion in defined benefit pension schemes and £500 billion in defined contribution schemes. And yet very little of that is invested in UK listed and unlisted equities. If just a small fraction was, that would give a huge amount of growth capital, long-term patient capital for those innovative businesses. And it would generate a higher return for pension savers who do very badly, actually, on pension returns in the UK. So that's one way in which we can try and unlock capital for some of those fast-growing businesses, keep more jobs in Britain, and generate better returns for people saving for their retirement.
Thank you. Turning to the international side, two questions before we open it up to the floor. A lot of what you've described in terms of wanting things that are listed in New York to be listed in London, jobs that are in Denmark to be shifted to jobs in the UK. These are frankly zero sum. And a month ago, we had prior to Yellen and Sullivan speeches, we had the Indian finance minister sitting where you are now sitting. And she was praising very heavily USTR Ambassador Tai's policy saying, this is great, this is what we want to do subsidies, we want to put up tariffs, we want to make sure goods sold in India are made in India. If we play out this game of subsidies and favoring domestic located firms and ownership and production, you said globalization is dead, we must care about where things are made and who owns them. If we play out this game, does the UK as a non-member of the EU and not a union with the US end up well off?
I totally understand your challenge, and I'm certainly not suggesting a retreat from trade. But I think it has to be different, and I think that security's got to be at the heart of it. You know, where things are made and who owns things does matter, and I think that has been revealed by some of the shocks to the global economy these last few years. But as I hope I made clear in the speech, a new multilateralism can emerge from the hyperglobalization of the past with stronger partnerships between countries whose values and interests are shared. But I also don't accept that it is a zero-sum game. The International Energy Agency says that $5 trillion a year needs to be spent on getting to net zero over the next 20 years. Even with the size of the Inflation Reduction Act, all that money is not going to come to the US. Every country in the world needs to be investing in these new industries of the future, and there are plenty of jobs to go round as we make that transition to a net zero economy. But we have been too reliant on countries like China, like Russia, and elsewhere for critical things, energy supplies and semiconductors. And in the interests of our security, we need to think again about those things. So it's not a retreat from trade, but it's about doing things differently in the interests of our economic security and also the security of working people.
Thank you for that. Relatedly, though not directly, one of the few things that I think most fair-minded economists say the succession of your opposite numbers in the UK government have gotten right in the last few years is that they've made non-EU immigration work. The UK has ended up with on net roughly the same amount of immigration, maybe a little more. This has come in areas where the UK had shortages of labor, like healthcare and certain professional skills. Obviously, you're not Shadow Home Secretary, but you're a member of the front bench and you're Shadow Chancellor. Usually, this kind of immigration is good for government balance sheets, whatever else is involved. How do you see immigration and the non-EU or high-skilled immigration going forward?
So businesses complain to me regularly that they struggle to recruit the people with the skills that they need and therefore want to bring in more workers from overseas. But at the same time, the size of the labour force in the UK has fallen since the pandemic. We've got something like 2.5 million people who should be at work who are not working because they are off on long-term sick, they're struggling with childcare and older people's care. You know, because some of our crucial public services aren't working properly, too many people are kept away from work. And so a modern supply-side approach will also require fixing our NHS and getting people off the sick list and helping some of the people who are currently absent from the labour market back into it. And we also need to do much more to skill up people already in Britain to do the jobs that are available, particularly the high-paid and high-skilled jobs. And I think we do turn in Britain too quickly to immigration to fix skill problems rather than training people up in Britain. So, of course, we've got to make sure that businesses can access the skills that they need to succeed. I want to keep those businesses in Britain, but government need to do much, much more to expand the existing labour market in the UK and ensure that people have the jobs to do those, the skills to do those jobs.
Thank you. And just to remind everyone, the government of the late Prime Minister Abe in Japan with womenomics as opposed to securonomics, by investing in those kinds of things, increased labor force participation by a few million women. So this is a vision I can certainly share. Let me open it up to the floor. Please, if you're near the front, raise your hand and Jessica can bring you a mic. If you're towards the back, please go to the standing mic. And no matter how famous you are or how well you know our speaker, please identify yourself when asking a question. Please.
EJ, am I on? Whoops.
We can hear you. Thank you.
On with the Brookings Institution across the street in the Washington Post. Thank you for a very interesting talk. There was an interesting tension, I thought, in the way in which you discussed the last Labor government. And I would love you to talk about the relationship of your project and Keir Starmer's to the new Labor project, because you seem to be saying at the same time, you seem to be saying at the same time, on the one hand, there were great things that happened under that old Labor government, but there were things wrong with it. I wanted to ask, what was wrong with it, and does that come from just a change in circumstances or from some rethinking at the level of theory and practice? And thanks again.
Well, thank you very much for coming along this morning, EJ. The last time that Labour won from opposition was 26 years ago, 1997. You have to be older than 70 in Britain to have voted for a Labour Prime Minister that's not called Tony Blair. So Tony Blair is the most successful leader that the Labour Party has ever had. And in the 13 years that Labour was in government under Tony and then Gordon Brown, it transformed Britain for the better. Our public services were on their knees when they became Prime Minister and Chancellor, and they rebuilt them. And our economic growth averaged between 2 and 2.5% between 97 and 2010. It's been about 1.4% in the 13 years under the Conservative governments that have followed. So I have huge respect for what Tony Blair and Gordon Brown did, but it was 26 years ago. And the challenges we face, the global environment and the environment at home, are just so different. You know, if you think about the big challenges we face globally, the rise of China, Russia's behavior in Europe, the challenge of meeting the climate emergency, those things just weren't on the agenda when Tony Blair and Gordon Brown held the reins all those years ago. So I think there's a huge amount that we can learn from what they did. I want to rebuild the public services that the Conservatives have decimated these last 13 years. I want to get that economic growth, but the way in which we do these things is different to the way in which they were able to achieve them 13 years ago. So they had the right answers, I believe, for the time, but there's got to be different answers to meet the challenges of today.
Thank you. So Jessica, what first preference goes to our external guests, not internal. So Jessica, that woman, the gentleman back there, if you could go to the standing mic, and then the woman in the orange jacket, please.
Thank you. I'm Katie Stallard from The New Statesman. Can I just press you a bit on where China fits into this vision of securonomics? In the last few weeks, we've seen the UK investment minister travel to Hong Kong to, I think, quote, re-engage. There seems to be an interest in restarting economic and trade dialogue. Would a Labour government take a more sceptical approach to China? And do you envisage hewing closer to a US approach of, restrictions on critical technology, restrictions on Chinese investment in critical industry?
It's a great question. We're getting close to when Rachel has to leave. So if the gentleman who raised his hand could go to the mic, we'll just gather the question. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Adam. Shadow Secretary, thanks so much for your speech. My name is Emmanuel Adam. I represent British American business. We incorporate the American Chamber in the UK and the British Chamber in the US. We are apolitical, but let me say that many of the points you made in your speech take a lot of boxes in our annual policy agenda, so we look forward to the conversation there. The question is, you drew a lot of comparisons between the industrial strategy that you propose with what the Biden administration is doing right now. The one thing that the Biden administration gets criticized for sometimes from the business community is a lack of a bold trade policy. You said that Britain would be a very active trading nation. So the question is, how have your industrial strategy go in par with an active trade policy? Thanks so much.
Thank you very much. And the last question.
Claire Healy with E3G. It was music to my ears, you talking about the net zero economy being the driver of this modern industrial growth strategy. If you could elaborate more on the US-UK green special relationship, what that looks like practically, and does that invite in other countries such as India, etc.?
Thank you very much for those questions. Shall I? Yeah. So first of all, Katie, on China, I think it would be a mistake to cut China out of the global economy, and it would cause huge damage as well to countries like Britain and the US that still trade very significantly with China. But I don't think we can be naive about the ways in which we trade. And I don't think we can compromise our economic or national security. And big errors have been made in the UK, allowing the Chinese to be so close to our nuclear energy programme in the UK, nearly allowing them to run our telecommunications infrastructure. Those are mistakes, and we must never make those sorts of mistakes again. So yes, trade, but we also need to protect those areas that are crucial for our economic and our national security. And that is one of the lessons that we need to learn. And that's one of the reasons why I say globalization, as we know it, is dead, the hyper-globalization of the past, but a new period of multilateralism between countries whose interests are shared will become more important than ever. And I guess that leads on really to the second question about the trade policy and the point I made in the speech about Britain both at once being too open and too closed. Too open in that we've hollowed out vast sections of our economy, and too closed in that we've put up unnecessary barriers in terms of trade with our neighbours and biggest trading partners in the European Union. Now, there's no going back into the single market or customs union. That ship has sailed. But we can build closer relationships with our European neighbours again. So, for example, I would like Britain to have a veterinary agreement with Europe, which would improve the flow of food and farming products between our countries. I would like to secure the mutual recognition of professional qualifications, so accountants, lawyers, architects, etc., who are trained up in Britain will have their qualifications recognised as they were before in Europe. I would like to help our fantastic creative and cultural industries in Britain by reducing some of the red tape and bureaucracy around visas for touring. So there are practical things that we can do to improve trade with our neighbours and trading partners. And I guess then linking to the third point about the green special relationship, because clearly an area of growth in terms of jobs and production is going to be in the clean energies of the future. And it's an area where, because of Britain's industrial heritage, because of our geography, because of our great existing businesses and the innovation coming out of our fantastic universities, we've got huge strengths. And we believe, with the right policies, Britain could become a net exporter of energy by the middle of the next decade. But none of these things will happen by chance, which is why I talk about a more strategic and agile state, working with businesses and working with partners abroad to seize these opportunities. And I think it's one of the real synergies between what you are doing here in the US and what I want an incoming Labour government to do in the UK, to learn from what is happening in terms of stimulating those industries in clean energy in the US, doing that in the UK, and then trading on the basis of those opportunities. And yes, of course, there will be global opportunities there as well, but the close links, for example, that already exist. I gave the example of aviation. You know, that as an industry is going to go through huge, profound change in the years ahead as we move to a net zero economy. There's already a huge trade relationship in that area. How can we move that forward so it's a green relationship, a green special relationship in the future? Of course, we would look to that with other countries, but I think there are real synergies and close partnerships that we can build on between the UK and the US.
Thank you so much for doing 3 questions in 2 minutes. and more broadly for sharing with us your vision and the Labour Party's vision for the UK economic future as part of the global assessments around globalization, industrial policy, and growth. Thank you all for joining us. We've had the privilege to host Rachel Reeves, the Right Honourable Rachel Reeves, MP for Leeds West and Shadow Chancellor of the Exchequer for the United Kingdom. Thank you.
Thank you, Adam.